Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to this segment of the 2004-2005 Presidential Lecture Series. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge and appreciate those who are responsible for this occasion. First of all, I'd like to thank the Office of the President, George Dennison, for facilitating and sponsoring a lecture series that continues to enrich the intellectual life of this university. Thank you, President Dennison. I also want to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Dr. Richard Drake, for his tireless efforts in coordinating this segment of the series and securing the caliber of speaker that we have tonight. It's indeed an honor for me to introduce Professor William Julius Wilson, someone that I greatly admire and for whom I have tremendous respect. He is undoubtedly one of the truly distinguished intellectuals of the American experience. Princeton, Columbia, Pennsylvania, Johns Hopkins, Dartmouth, Northwestern, and the University of Amsterdam are among 39 institutions that have appreciated and recognized his contributions to scholarship with the conferment of doctorate degrees honoris causa. He is currently the Lewis P. and Linda L. Giza University Professor at Harvard University, one of only 18 professors accorded this highest intellectual distinction. After graduating from Washington State University in 1966, the PhD, Professor Wilson taught sociology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst before joining the University of Chicago in 1972. In 1990, he was appointed the Lucy Flower University Professor and Director of the University of Chicago's Center for the Study of Urban Inequality. He joined the faculty at Harvard in 1996. A past president of the American Sociological Association and a MacArthur Prize Fellow from 1987 to 1992, Wilson has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Education, the American Philosophical Society, and the Institute of Medicine. In June of 1996, he was selected by Time magazine as one of America's 25 most influential people. He is a recipient of the 1998 National Medal of Science, the highest scientific honor in the United States, and was awarded the Talcott Parsons Prize in the Social Sciences by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2003. He is the author of numerous publications, including The Declining Significance of Race, which won the American Sociological Association's Sidney Spivak Award, The Truly Disadvantaged, which was selected by the editors of the New York Times Book Review as one of the 16 best books of 1987. And it also received the Washington Monthly Annual Book Award. Another of his publications, When Work Disappears, The World of the New Urban Poor, which was selected as one of the notable books of 1996 by the editors of the New York Times Review of Books. It also received the Sidney Hillman Foundation Awards. And last but not the least, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, Rising Inequality and Coalition Politics. Other honors that he has received include the Seidman Award in Political Economy. In fact, this is the first and only non-economist to receive this award. The Golden Plate Achievement Award, the Distinguished Alumnus Award, Washington State University, The American Sociological Association's Dubois Johnson Fraser Award for significant scholarship in the field of intergroup relations. The American Sociological Association's Award for Public Understanding of Sociology. Burton Gordon Fieldman Award for outstanding contributions in the field of public policy. Brandeis University and the Martin Luther King Jr. National Award granted by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Los Angeles. Professor Wilson is a member of numerous national boards and commissions and was previously the chair of the board of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences and of the Russell Sage Foundation. You will all agree with me that we are indeed fortunate to have him as our 2005 presidential speaker. Please join me in welcoming Professor William J. Wilson to the podium.
Thank you very much. President Dennison, members of the faculty and administration, students, and guests. I'm really very pleased to deliver the annual Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture in the President's Lecture Series. I think that my remarks tonight about the world of the new urban poor would resonate with Dr. King if he were alive. Dr. King not only fought for civil rights in the last few years of his life, he became a strong advocate for the social rights of American citizens, including the right to employment, economic security, education, and health care. Indeed, the theme of social rights was central to his Poor People's Campaign. His shift in emphasis from civil rights to social rights shortly before his death coincided with the publication of several thoughtful articles in the latter 1960s, and perhaps he was influenced by these articles. Articles that raised questions about the direction and goals of the Black protest movement. Basically, the authors of these articles made it clear that from 1955 to 1965, the chief objectives of the civil rights movement were to integrate public accommodations and eliminate Black disfranchisement. These were matters of constitutional rights and basic human dignity, matters that affected Blacks and other minorities exclusively and therefore could be defined and addressed simply as problems of civil rights. However, these authors also noted that despite the spectacular civil rights victories, by the latter half of the 1990s, or I should say 1960s, a more complex and fundamental set of problems had yet to be attacked. Problems of jobs, education, and housing that affected not only African Americans, but other people of color and whites as well. A consistent theme running throughout these articles was that in the period from 1955 to 1963, all Blacks regardless of their station in life, were concerned about eliminating discrimination in public accommodations and in voting. As the late civil rights leader Bayard Rustin put it, quote, Ralph Bunche was as likely to be refused service in a restaurant or hotel as any illiterate sharecropper. This common bond prevented the latent class differences and resentments from being openly expressed, unquote. In America, people have not really succeeded unless they can pass the chance for success onto their children. Until the 1960s, even the few members of the black middle class had great difficulty in doing so. Empirical research on the occupational attainment and mobility of blacks in the early 1960s could uncover no evidence that the effects of class on occupation and income were comparable to the effects of race. As my Harvard colleague Jennifer Hochschild put it, quote, race was such a powerful variable that even the most modest of class effects, the stratified whites, were canceled by the skin color of blacks. In other words, blacks experienced a perverse sort of egalitarianism. Neither the disadvantages of poverty nor the advantages of wealth made much difference in what they could achieve or pass on to their children. Discrimination swamped everything else, unquote. However, research by the sociologist Michael Hout, published in 1984, revealed that between 1962 and 1973, class began to affect career and generational mobility for blacks as it had regularly done for whites. In particular, blacks from the most advantaged backgrounds experienced the greatest upward mobility. For the first time in American history, well-off blacks could begin to expect their success to persist and accumulate. Since 1973, these trends have continued and are reflected in the accomplishments of the civil rights struggle. Rising number of blacks in professional, technical, managerial, and administrative positions. Progress was also evident in the enrollment of blacks in colleges and universities and the growing number of black homeowners. On the other hand, among the disadvantaged segments of the black population, especially the ghetto poor, many dire problems, joblessness, concentrated poverty, family breakup, and the receipt of welfare were getting even worse. These developments were clear to the several intellectuals who wrote about the impact of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. It did not take them long to realize that the group that had profited the most from the civil rights legislation up to 1965 was middle-class blacks, blacks who had competitive resources, such as education, steady incomes, and special talents. As the black psychologist Kenneth B. Clark argued in 1967, quote, the masses of Negroes are now starkly aware of the fact that recent civil rights victories benefited a small percentage of middle-class Negroes while their predicament remained the same or worsened, unquote. What these observers were telling us in the latter 1960s is that a close examination of ghetto black discontent, most dramatically seen in the riots of that period, revealed issues that transcended the creation and implementation of civil rights laws. Quote, "To the segregation by race," Bayard Rustin observed, quote, "was now added segregation by class. And all the problems created by segregation and poverty, inadequate schooling, substandard and overcrowded housing, lack of access to jobs and job training, narcotics and crime were greatly aggravated," unquote. In short, for ghetto blacks, the problems moved beyond the issue of civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. recognized this point in 1968 when shortly before his death he asked, quote, "What good is it to be allowed to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford a hamburger?" Unquote. It would not be unfair to suggest that he was probably influenced by the thoughts of Bayard Rustin, who 3 years earlier in his now classic article From Protest to Politics phrased the matter in much the same way. Quote, "What is the value of winning access to public accommodations for those who lack the resources to use them?" Unquote. Thus, these perceptive civil rights advocates recognized in the 1960s that removing artificial racial barriers would not enable poor blacks to compete equally with other groups in society for valued resources because of the accumulation of disadvantages flowing from previous periods of prejudice and discrimination. Basic changes in our modern industrial economy have compounded the problems of poor blacks because education and training have become more important for entry into the more desirable and higher-paying jobs, and because increased reliance on labor-saving devices has contributed to a surplus of untrained black workers. In short, once the movement faced these more fundamental issues, argued Rustin in 1965, quote, "it was compelled to expand its vision beyond race relations to economic relations, including the role of education in society," unquote. Fully aware of the need for a broader vision on inequality, Dr. King organized his Poor People's Campaign that culminated in a Poor People's March on Washington to raise our consciousness and conscience about poverty in America. If he were alive today, he would be greatly disturbed by a new kind of poverty in our inner cities. By the new urban poverty, I mean poor, segregated neighborhoods in which substantial percentages of individual adults are either unemployed or have dropped out of or never been a part of the labor force. This jobless poverty stands in sharp contrast to previous periods. In 1950, a substantial portion of the inner city population was poor, but they were working. Urban poverty was quite extensive, but people held jobs. However, by 1990, joblessness in ghetto neighborhoods had reached unprecedented heights. The high joblessness has adversely affected not only individuals and families, but the social life of neighborhoods as well. Inner city joblessness is a severe problem that is often overlooked or obscured when the focus is mainly on poverty and its consequences. Inner cities have always featured high levels of poverty, but the rates of joblessness today far exceeds those of previous years. I should note that when I speak of joblessness, I am not solely referring to official unemployment. The unemployment rate represents only the percentage of workers in the official labor force, that is, those who are actively looking for work. It does not include those who are outside of or have dropped out of the labor market. including millions of adult males who appear in the census statistics but are not recorded in the labor market statistics. These uncounted males in the labor force are disproportionately represented in inner-city ghetto neighborhoods, and because they, along with other low-income males in the inner city, epitomize the problems of the new urban poverty, let me examine their situation in closer detail. In the last 3 decades, low-skilled African American males have encountered increasing difficulty gaining access to jobs, even menial jobs. Although the employment and wages of all low-skilled workers improved during the economic boom period of the late 1990s and into 2000, the country is now experiencing slow job growth following the recession of 2001. Jobless rates, especially those in the inner city, are on the rise again. The ranks of idle street corner men have swelled since the early 1970s and include a growing proportion of adult males who routinely work in and tolerate low-wage jobs when they are available. What has caused the deterioration in the employment prospects of low-skilled black males? Although blacks continue to confront racial barriers in the labor market, many inner-city African-American workers have been victimized by the decreased relative demand for low-skilled labor. The computer revolution, that is the spread of new technologies, is displacing low-skilled workers and rewarding the more highly trained, and the growing internationalization of economic activity has increasingly pitted low-skilled workers in the United States against low-skilled workers around the world. These changes have benefited highly educated or highly skilled workers, while lower-skilled workers face the growing threat of eroding wages and job displacement. One of the legacies of historic racism in America is a disproportionate number of African American workers who are unskilled. Accordingly, the decreased relative demand for low-skilled labor has had a greater adverse impact on blacks than on whites, whereas a number of skilled African Americans, including managers, professionals, and technicians, has markedly increased in the last few years. The proportion of those who are unskilled is still relatively large. Why? Because the black population, held back by the cumulative experiences of racial restrictions, was overwhelmingly unskilled as late as the mid-20th century. Recent research into the urban labor market by the economist Harry Holzer demonstrates the magnitude of the problem. Based on a survey of 3,000 employers in Atlanta, Boston, Detroit, and Los Angeles, Holzer reported that only 5 to 10% of the jobs in central city areas for non-college graduates require very few cognitive skills or work credentials. A much greater premium is being placed on workers who have the basic skills of writing, reading, and performing arithmetic calculations, and who know how to operate a computer. Moreover, most employers in Holzer's study indicated that they require a high school degree, job references, and particular kinds of work experience. Given the oversupply of unskilled workers relative to the number of low-skilled jobs, many poorly trained and low-educated individuals experience difficulty landing jobs, even in a strong local economy. This is especially true of black men. In addition, over the past several decades, low-skilled black males have been disproportionately displaced from the manufacturing sector, a trend that has continued up to today, as black males have lost more than 300,000 manufacturing jobs since 2002, the sharpest job loss in percentage terms of any ethnic group. Today, most of the new jobs for workers with limited education and experience are in the service sector, which hires relatively more women. The movement of lower-skilled men into the growth sectors of the economy has been slow. For example, only a small percentage of men have penetrated pink-collar jobs, like practical nursing in recent years. Indeed, the striking gender differences in recent job growth are partly due to the large concentration of women in the expanding social service sector. Lower-educated women, unlike their male counterparts, are working more, not less, than in previous years. The employment patterns of lower-educated women, like those with higher training and education, reflect the growth of social service industries. For inner-city black males, the problems created by the decreased relative demand for labor have been aggravated by negative employer attitudes. Interviews of a representative sample of Chicago area employers by my research team in the late 1980s revealed that a substantial majority of employers considered inner-city black males to be either uneducated, uncooperative, unstable, or dishonest. For example, a suburban drugstore manager commented, quote, "It's unfortunate, but in my business, I think overall black men tend to be known to be dishonest. I think that's too bad, but that's the image they have." Interviewer: "So you think it's an image problem?" Respondent: "An image problem of being dishonest men and lazy. They're known to be lazy. They are," he laughs. "I hate to tell you, but it's all an image, though. Whether they are or not, I don't know, but it's an image that is perceived." I see. Interviewer: "I see. How do you think that image was developed?" Employer: "Go look in the jails." He laughs. A suburban employer of an electrical services firm concerned about theft offered the following unique explanation for why he would not hire an inner-city black male. He states, quote, "If you're in a white neighborhood and you have a manufacturing firm and a ghetto person comes there to apply, it doesn't make any difference what color his skin is. If you know that that's where he's from, you know several things. One is that if you give him a job there, he's going to be unbelievably pressured to give information to his peer group in the ghetto about the security system, the comings and goings of what's of value there that we could rip off. He's not a crook. He wants no part of it, but he lives in an area where he may be physically or in danger of his life if he doesn't provide the information to the people that live around him. As a manager, I know that, and I'm not going to hire him because of that. I'm not discriminating against him because he's black. I'm discriminating against him because he has a problem that he's going to bring to me. Now, the fact that he is black and it happens that the people around him are black is only coincidental. In Warsaw, they were Jews. They had the same problem," unquote. A president of an inner-city manufacturing firm expressed a different reservation about employing black males from certain ghetto neighborhoods. Quote, "If somebody gave me their address, Cabrini Green, which used to be a housing project in Chicago, if somebody gave me their address, Cabrini Green, I might unavoidably have some concerns." Interviewer: "What would be your concerns?" Respondent: "That the poor guy probably would be frequently unable to get to work, and I probably would watch him more carefully, even if it wasn't fair, than I would with somebody else. I know what I should do, though, is recognize that here's a guy that is trying to get out of his situation and probably will work harder than somebody else who's already out there, and he might be the best one around here. But I think I would have to struggle accepting that premise at the beginning, unquote. Because of the prevalence of such attitudes, the lack of access to informal job networks is a notable problem for black males, as suggested by the following employer's comments to our interviewer. Quote, all of a sudden, they take a look at a guy, and unless he's got an in, the reason why I hired this black kid the last time is because my neighbor said to me, yeah, I used him for a few days, he's good. And I said, you know what? I'm going to take a chance. But it was a recommendation. But other than that, I've got a walk-in, and who knows? And I think that for the most part, a guy sees a black man, he's a bit hesitant because I don't know, unquote. Now, such attitudes are classic examples of what economists call statistical discrimination. Employers make general assumptions about inner-city black male workers and reach decisions based on those assumptions without reviewing systematically the qualifications of an individual applicant. The net effect is that many inner-city black male applicants are never given the opportunity to prove their qualifications on an individual level. Although it is true that some of these men eschew entry-level jobs because of the working conditions and low wages, many others would readily accept such employment. Statistical discrimination, although representing elements of class bias against poor inner-city workers, is clearly a racial practice. Far more inner-city black males are effectively screened out of employment than Latino or white males applying for the same jobs. Unfortunately, the negative effects of employer perceptions on inner-city black males have been compounded by the restructuring of the economy. The increasing shift to service industries has resulted in a greater demand for workers who can effectively serve and relate to the consumer. Many employers feel that unlike women and immigrants who have recently expanded the labor pool in the low-wage service sector, inner-city black males lack such qualities. Consequently, their rejection in the labor market gradually grows over time. Now, this is especially true, especially the case for the low-skilled black males who have prison records. The ranks of ex-offenders have increased significantly in the past several decades because rates of incarceration have soared even during periods when the crime rate has declined. Ex-offenders have a much more difficult time finding employment. According to one estimate, probably 30% of all civilian young adult males, 16 to 34, are ex-offenders. To repeat, because of the decreased relative demand for low-skilled labor, inner-city black males, including ex-offenders, are forced to turn to the low-wage service sector for employment, where they compete, often unsuccessfully, with a growing number of female and immigrant workers. The more these men complain or manifest their job dissatisfaction, the less attractive they seem to employers. They therefore encounter greater discrimination when they search for employment and clash more often with employers or with supervisors when they are hired. The expressed feeling of many inner-city black males about their job and job prospects reflect their plummeting position in a changing economy. The economic woes of low-skilled black males, like the economic problems of all disadvantaged workers, subside in a strong economy featuring a tight labor market, a labor market in which unemployment is low. But you see, the problem is that in recent years, tight labor markets, low unemployment, have been of relatively short duration, frequently followed by a recession that either wiped out previous gains for many workers or did not allow others to fully recover from a previous period of economic stagnation. It would take sustained tight labor markets over many years to draw back those discouraged inner-city workers who have dropped out of the labor market altogether, some for very long periods of time. Now, in this connection, the nation recently concluded one of the longest economic recoveries in the last half century. During that recovery, disadvantaged groups advanced economically. Real wage growth for low-skilled workers was quite impressive from 1996 to 2000. For example, except for male workers at the 90th percentile of the wage distribution, those at the 30th percentile and below experienced the highest percentage hourly wage increase during this period. Now, increases in the minimum wage during President Clinton's second term in office and unexpectedly low inflation helped to account for some of this wage growth, but the prolonged, strong economy undoubtedly contributed. Also, the ranks of those in the labor market who were out of work for more than 6 months, what we call the long-term jobless, declined from almost 2 million in January 1993 to about 700,000 in December of 2000. Moreover, the unemployment rate of high school dropouts declined from 12% in 1992 to just 6% at the end of year 2000. And most of this decline occurred between 1997 and 2000. Furthermore, the black unemployment rate dipped to 7% in 2000, the lowest since the Bureau of Labor Statistics began compiling comparable unemployment data by race in 1972. The positive effects of these changes are seen in even the most depressed neighborhoods of the city. A study of low-wage workers in 322 metropolitan areas by the economists Richard Freeman and William M. Rogers revealed that black men aged 16 to 24 with a high school education or less, including many with prison records, were employed in greater numbers, earned larger paychecks, and committed far fewer crimes than in the early 1990s. The benefits of a strong economy, particularly a sustained tight labor market for low-skilled workers, should be emphasized in economic policy discussions. Unlike the situation for workers in a tight labor market, the labor market with low unemployment, in a slack labor market, a labor market with high unemployment, employers are, indeed can afford to be, more selective in recruiting and in granting promotions. They overemphasize job prerequisites and exaggerate the value of experience. In such an economic climate, disadvantaged minorities, especially those with low levels of literacy, suffer disproportionately and employer discrimination rises. In a tight labor market, on the other hand, job vacancies are numerous, unemployment is of short duration, and wages are higher. Moreover, in a tight labor market, the labor force expands because increased job opportunities not only reduce unemployment, but also draw into the labor force those workers who, in periods when the labor market is slack, respond to fading job prospects by dropping out of the labor force altogether. Thus, in a tight labor market, the status of all workers, including disadvantaged minorities, improves because of lower unemployment and higher wages. However, since 2001, economic stagnation has set in, beginning with a recession and followed by a jobless recovery. And the cost of the Iraq recovery and the war against terrorism are adding to an already huge national deficit that will, according to many economists, exacerbate the faltering economy in the years ahead. Now, this is unfortunate. If the economic boom of the latter 1990s could have been extended for several more years, it would have significantly lowered the overall jobless rate in areas such as the inner city ghetto, not only for low-skilled workers still in the labor force, but for those who have been outside the labor market for many years as well. But given the decreased relative demand for low-skilled labor, what will happen to low-skilled inner-city males during a prolonged economic downturn? In the absence of employment policies to enhance the job prospects of disadvantaged groups, there is little reason to assume that their long-term prospects will be anything but bleak. Why? Simply because the economic trend that has twisted against low-skilled workers, whose effects have been muted somewhat by the prolonged recovery, is unlikely to reverse itself, thereby diminishing in the long term their job prospects and earnings. The employment problems could reach the crisis level for many inner-city job applicants who are physically isolated from places of employment and socially isolated from the informal job networks that have become a major source of job placement. The growing suburbanization of jobs, both in manufacturing and services, has cut off inner-city minorities from many work opportunities. Unlike previous years, labor markets today are mainly regional, and long commutes in automobiles are common. Most ghetto residents cannot afford an automobile and therefore have to rely on public transit systems that make the connection between inner-city neighborhoods and suburban job locations difficult and time-consuming. To make matters worse, many inner-city residents lack information or knowledge about suburban job opportunities. In the segregated inner-city ghettos, the breakdown of the informal job information network aggravates the problems of job spatial mismatch. All of these problems elevate the labor market woes of low-skilled black males, and over the long term affects their feelings about themselves and their relations with their families. Accordingly, it is important to link attitudinal and other cultural traits with the structure of opportunity. Among these cultural traits is a commitment to fatherhood. Indeed, the lack of commitment to fatherhood among many inner-city black males is a cultural problem that grows out of restricted opportunities and constraints. More specifically, many inner-city fathers today have low self-efficacy when it comes to fatherhood, whether they are willing to admit it or not. Included among the norms of fatherhood is the obligation to provide adequate and consistent material support for your family. Continuing lack of success in the labor market reduces the ability of many inner-city men to adequately support their children, which in turn lowers their self-confidence as providers and creates antagonistic relations with the mother of their children. Convenient rationalizations, shared and reinforced by the men in these restrictive economic situations, emerge that reject the institution of marriage in ways that enhance, not diminish, their self-esteem. The outcome is a failure to meet the societal norms of fatherhood. However, even non-custodial fathers who are employed and want to meet the responsibilities of fatherhood face the daunting problem of heavy child support payments now required by federal law. The child support payments represent an employment tax of 36% of a worker's wages. And if the non-custodial father is in arrears, the federal law allows states to deduct as much as 65% of his wages. Now, many of those who face this higher tax are ex-offenders whose delinquent child support payments accumulated while they were in prison. The high child support payments is a disincentive to remain in the formal labor market and an incentive to move into the casual or informal labor market. Now, the picture I have painted is pretty bleak, and there are many public policy options that could be or ought to be pursued to address these problems. Well, even if the economy is strong, special programs are needed to enhance the employment prospects of black males, especially those who reside in segregated and isolated inner-city neighborhoods. However, in a weak economy, such programs become crucial. I have identified a number of causes of the diminishing employment prospects of inner-city black males, ranging from the decreased relative demand for low-skilled labor to the growth of regional labor markets. But let me now focus on some realistic programs that could enhance their employment prospects, followed by a discussion of the need to pursue programs that attack the broader problems of inequality, not just problems that are race-specific. I will conclude my lecture with a discussion of these broader problems. First of all, I think it is really important to promote school-to-work transition in inner-city neighborhoods with the use of special internships and apprenticeships, especially for high school seniors. According to a report from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 42% of black youth who had not enrolled in college had jobs in October after graduating from high school a few months earlier in June, compared with 69% of their white counterparts. The figure for black youngsters in inner-city neighborhoods, especially black males, are obviously even lower. Moreover, programs such as the Jobs Corps and Youth Build should be expanded to help youth who are unemployed and in need of training and assistance in locating and securing jobs. Furthermore, skilled training programs similar to Strive and Project Quest that include both soft and hard skill training and job placement should be expanded. Restoring the cuts in the Job Training Fund under the Workforce Investment Act would be helpful in this connection, as well as providing more funds to increase job placement and transportation programs such as America Works in inner-city neighborhoods. Finally, we should review ways to relieve the work disincentives associated with the child support payments. For example, various forms of arrearage forgiveness might be considered, especially for men who pile up arrears in child support payments while incarcerated or otherwise incapacitated. Programs that focus on the cultural problems pertaining to fatherhood without confronting the broader and more fundamental issue of restricted economic opportunities have limited chances to succeed. In my view, the most effective fatherhood programs in the inner city will be those that address attitudes, norms, and behavior in combination with local and national attempts to improve job prospects. Only then will fathers have a realistic chance to adequately care for their children and envision a better life for themselves. Now let me conclude with some brief thoughts about broader, more fundamental issues that ought to be considered. Although racial discrimination and segregation exacerbate the labor market problems of the low-skilled African Americans, we must not lose sight of the fact that many of these problems are currently driven by fundamental changes in the new global economy. Nonetheless, there is a tendency among policymakers, scholars, and black leaders alike to view the economic problems in the black community, the poor black community, separately from the national and international trends affecting American families and neighborhoods. If the economic problems of the African American community are defined solely in racial terms, they can be isolated and viewed as requiring only race-based solutions as proposed by those on the left, or narrow political solutions with subtle racial connotations such as welfare reform as offered by those on the right. The impact of broader economic patterns on the African American population is perhaps best revealed in the following figure. As seen in the top graph of this figure, between 1947 and 1973, the lowest quintile, the lowest fifth in family income, experienced the highest growth in annual real income. This is from 1947 to 1973, which meant that the poor were becoming less poor, not only in relative terms, but in absolute terms as well. However, this pattern changed in the early 1970s. Growth slowed, and the distribution of inflation-adjusted income started to become more unequal. Look at the bottom graph. Whereas average family income gains from 1974 to 1997 continued for the higher quintiles, especially the top fifth, including the top 5%, whose income gains even exceeded those of the earlier period. And with the tax cuts, that would zoom up there even higher. And I've benefited from the tax cuts, by the way. I was just thinking about President Clinton's speech. I was going to send Bush a note and thank him for it, and I realized that other people are not benefiting. So whereas average family income gains from 1974 to 1997 continued for the higher quintiles, especially the top fifth, including the top 5%, whose income gains even exceeded those of the earlier period. Look at the top 5% in 1997 from 1974 to 1997 and compare that with the earlier period. Quite a significant difference. So, while these gains were being enjoyed by the top groups, the lowest quintile experienced annual declines in income during this period from 1974 to 1997, and the second lowest experienced stagnating incomes. Now, there were signs that the rising inequality, had entered a period of remission during the economic boom period of the latter 1990s and into 2000, only to resume again in this current period of economic stagnation. Given that African Americans are disproportionately concentrated among the more economically disadvantaged groups, they benefited enormously from the broadly equal pattern of family economic progress in the earlier period and suffered disproportionately during the latter period. History shows that trends of rising inequality are associated not only with economic changes, including the changing rate of productivity growth and economic growth, but also with the eroding strength of what the MIT economist Frank Levy calls the nation's equalizing institutions. These include public education, unions, the welfare state broadly defined, international trade regulations, and so on. These equalizing institutions were much stronger from 1947 to 1973, as reflected in that top graph. It's one of the reasons why you had fairly equal distributions of income, because the equalizing institutions were much stronger during that period, much stronger than they are today. And they will have to be strengthened to help check the rising inequality. Now, the late black economist Vivian Henderson recognized the impact of broader economic trends on the black community, and in 1975 warned the nation against a short-sighted vision that focused exclusively on race. He stated, quote, "The economic future of blacks in the United States is bound up with that of the rest of the nation. Politics designed in the future to cope with the problems of the poor and victimized will also yield benefits to blacks," unquote. And given Dr. King's efforts to address the problems of poverty among all racial groups in his Poor People's Campaign, if he were alive today, there is no doubt that he would strongly endorse Vivian Henderson's arguments. Thank you.
Professor Wilson will accept some questions. There are two microphones here. Please be very brief in your questions or comments. Questions, comments?
Professor Wilson, I wonder, would strengthening these equalizing institutions have prolonged the economic boom that closed in the 1990s that was such advantage to local civilians?
You know, I wish I could answer that question. I'm not an economist, although I followed very closely macroeconomics. I cannot say, and I would be hesitant to say, that if we had stronger equalizing institutions, the economic boom would have continued. There are just so many complex factors related to productivity growth and economic growth that are beyond my expertise, so I really can't speak to that point. My guess is, however, is that these equalizing institutions would have, during this period, would have probably narrowed the gap between the haves and the have-nots even more. Whether or not they would have prolonged the economic boom period, I just don't know. Well, you people, let me just say, I got 2 hours sleep last night, so if you don't want to ask me any more questions, that's fine. I missed my connection from Boston to Minneapolis, and I ended up in Kalispell, yeah, at 12 midnight last night. And then I took a hotel room and flew back 6 o'clock flight this morning. So I've been going. So have mercy.
Dr. Wilson, in your suggestions for changes in the future, you seem to mention a lot that sounded to me like vocational education.
Yeah.
And I guess just thinking about things like Robert Putnam and whatnot in terms of civic participation, don't you think that, how do you feel about the idea that if you only have vocational education dealing with economics, that you're, even if people are trained, they'd still be vulnerable to the economy, whereas perhaps addressing civic or political things in education could lead to changes at different levels?
I couldn't agree with him more. But I was just trying to be realistic, given the current climate, about what is possible, what is realistic. And I feel that it's better to have some of these modest programs that I talked about than doing nothing, which is what we're now doing. As I said to the group this afternoon, proposals to address poverty and joblessness used to be on the back burner. Now they're completely off the stove. But I agree strongly with Bob Putnam. But I was just trying to suggest ways in which we could possibly make a dent. But I'm realistic enough to know that it wouldn't fundamentally address these problems. And that's why I concluded my discussion with equalizing institutions and talking about these more general problems that should be addressed by a coalition of groups, a coalition of the have-nots and some of the haves, whites, blacks, Latinos, Asians, people recognizing their commonalities, moving beyond their differences, and developing the political muscle to put these things back on the table.
Last question, please.
Dr. Wilson, you spoke about rates of incarceration increasing among young black males despite overall crime rates falling, and that being a compounding factor of the economic plight of that group. And I was wondering if you could address some of the underlying problems that drive that inversely proportional.
Yeah, well, one reason why the incarceration rate has increased during the period when the crime rate dropped is because more rigorous sentencing. Before, people used to get suspended sentences, and now many of them are going to prison just for what I would consider to be relatively minor offenses regarding drugs. And prisons are overcrowded. And one of the problems is that these people are released from prisons and they're stigmatized. And they're they were at a disadvantage going into prison. They're even worse off when they come out because they have the stigma of being an ex-offender. In previous years, there used to be training and education for our inmates prior to their release, getting them ready to enter the labor market. Those programs have been virtually eliminated. Now people just talk about locking people up and throwing away the key, 4 strikes and you're out kind of thing. Well, I think that people are now beginning to realize that the prisons are overcrowded, that we're not really addressing the problems, that they're getting worse, that we need to re-examine our policies. And I suspect that maybe not in the next 4 years, but probably within the next decade or so, we'll see some changes along these lines.